A woman sits at a low table with a cracked porcelain bowl in front of her. The break is thin, almost clean. She has mixed the glue. She has lined up the two pieces. All she needs is a steady hand. But the more carefully she tries to hold it, the worse it gets. Her fingers tighten. The edge slips. A smear crosses the glaze. She presses harder to correct it, and the pressure opens a second hairline crack beside the first. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no sudden collapse, just the quiet, humiliating moment when a thing becomes worse because someone wanted too badly to make it right. Most of us know this moment. We know it in work. We know it in conversation. We know it in grief, in leadership, in love, in decisions that will not become clearer no matter how violently we think at them. The obvious answer is more effort, more control, more concentration, but sometimes the hand that wants control becomes the disturbance. That is the crisis hidden inside the old Daoist idea usually called Wu Wei. If force can corrupt action, then discipline is not always wisdom. Ambition is not always clarity. Control is not always contact with reality. A person can be sincere, focused, morally serious, and still damage the situation by trying to dominate it. So the question is simple. What happens when action stops trying to force life? This is not an argument about doing nothing. It is not a promise that the world rewards surrender. It is not the soft self-help version of Lao Tzu where everything difficult disappears if we just relax. The harder question is much more interesting. What kind of action remains when the will stops trying to overpower everything it touches? The tradition gives that question a name, Wu Wei. The phrase is often translated as non-action, non-doing, or effortless action. Every translation is dangerous if we hear it too quickly. Non-action sounds like passivity. Effortless action sounds like a trick. Non-doing sounds like withdrawal. But the early Daoist materials keep pushing towards something subtler, action without coercive forcing, response without domination, movement that has not lost contact with the shape of the world. By the end of tonight, we will have followed this question to its honest limit, including the places where it refuses to resolve cleanly. We will use the familiar name Lao Tzu while being careful about the textual uncertainty behind it. The Daodejing, also called the Lao Tzu, is not a clean modern book by a recoverable author in the way we might imagine. It is a layered text, carried through transmission, translation, and interpretation, and we will also turn to the Zhuangzi, not as though it were Lao Tzu speaking again, but as a related Daoist current that gives this problem bodies, hands, trees, rulers, and skilled movement. We begin with the hand that presses too hard. Because before Wu Wei is a doctrine, it is a problem we can feel. If you enjoy thinking through questions like this with us, subscribing helps others find them too. Sharing the video helps even more. Let's begin. Why can more effort make action worse? The first answer is that effort is not one thing. We often speak as though effort were a single substance. You add more of it and the result improves. You add less of it and the result weakens. That picture is simple. It is also false. We know this from the body before we know it from philosophy. A hand can press with care, or it can press with panic. A voice can speak firmly, or it can bear down until the other person disappears. A plan can guide attention, or it can make attention impossible. So we have to distinguish effort from forcing. Effort can be intelligent, it can be patient, it can give itself to the object. Forcing is different. Forcing begins when the will stops receiving information from the thing it is touching. It already knows what the situation must become. It treats resistance as an insult. It turns the world into material for its own intention. That is why forcing can grow more clumsy as it grows more intense. The hand is doing more but perceiving less. The mind is working harder but listening less. We have all seen this. Someone repeats an argument more loudly because the first attempt failed. A leader adds another rule because the last rule created disorder. A person tries to repair a damaged friendship by demanding the very trust that can only return slowly. More pressure does not always mean more contact. This is the first doorway into Wu Wei. The doctrine is not born from a hatred of action. It is born from a suspicion about bad action that looks serious from the outside. The forced person may seem committed. They may be busy. They may be morally certain. They may be admired for decisiveness. But the question is not only how much action is visible. The question is whether the action still belongs to the situation. We should be careful here, because this can sound softer than it is. Non-forcing is not the advice to become vague. It is not the preference for comfort over difficulty. Sometimes a situation asks us to act with force in the ordinary sense of firmness. A door must be opened. A harm must be stopped. A word must be spoken. Daoist suspicion does not erase these facts. It asks something prior. Has our firmness remained responsive, or has it become a private demand imposed on reality? Think again of the cracked bowl. The woman is not wrong to want repair. She is not wrong to care. Her failure begins when caring becomes a grip. The material needs steadiness, time, pressure in the right place, and pressure withdrawn from the wrong place. Her will wants the result now. That impatience makes the object smaller than it is. It makes the bowl into a problem to be conquered, rather than a thing to be met. We can hear why early Daoist texts return so often to humble images: water, wood, a valley, an uncarved block. These are not decorations. They slow down the habit of abstraction. They ask us to look at relations. How does water meet stone? How does a branch survive wind? How does a tool become useful by following the grain? Before we are given a system, we are given ways of seeing. This matters because forcing often hides inside good language. We call it responsibility. We call it discipline. We call it standards. Sometimes those words are honest. Sometimes they are masks. A person can use the language of responsibility to avoid the humiliation of listening. A government can use the language of order to multiply interference. A teacher can use the language of correction to erase the living intelligence of a student. The old Daoist suspicion begins exactly there, where virtue language starts protecting the will from reality. We are not being asked to despise intention. That would be another simplification. Intention matters. Without it, action loses direction. But intention must remain permeable. It has to be corrected by the world it enters. When intention becomes sealed, action becomes coercive. It may still get results. It may even win applause. But something in the relation has been damaged. This is one of the hardest parts for a modern viewer, because we live inside cultures that often measure seriousness by visible strain. We trust the clenched jaw. We respect the packed schedule. We imagine that if an action did not exhaust us, it was not real effort. Wu Wei does not merely comfort us against this, it unsettles the assumption beneath it. Perhaps some of our strain is not evidence of depth. Perhaps it is evidence that we are moving against the shape of things, but we must not go too far. The opposite error is also waiting. A person can turn non-forcing into an excuse never to be interrupted by another's need. They can call avoidance wisdom. They can call laziness naturalness. They can call fear a refined refusal to impose. That is why we have to keep the distinction sharp. Passivity abandons the situation. Responsiveness remains with it. Passivity says, I will not be touched. Responsiveness says, I will not add the wrong kind of pressure. The difference is subtle when described. It is obvious when lived. We know the friend who listens before advising. We know the friend who uses advice to regain control. We know the doctor who studies the patient before treating. We know the technician who forces every problem into the method they already prefer. We know the leader who can wait until the moment is ready. We know the leader who mistakes constant intervention for care. Wu Wei begins in that difference. The point is not that the responsive person always succeeds. Early Daoist texts do not give us a guarantee. They are not selling a life in which the world finally cooperates. Their claim is stranger and more severe. They suggest that the quality of action changes when the will ceases to dominate the field. What appears after that may be quieter. It may also be more exact. So when we ask what happens when action stops forcing life, the first answer is not peace. It is perception. The hand begins to feel again. The voice begins to hear the room again. The mind begins to notice that the situation was not waiting passively for our command. It already had tendencies, openings, limits, and resistances. Action becomes possible because contact has returned. That return of contact is where the rest of the question will move. We will not receive a slogan. We will receive a series of pressures against our ordinary picture of action. The text will make naming unstable. Wu Wei will refuse to mean mere inactivity. Water will act without competing. The ruler will learn that interference can create the disorder it fears. The skilled body will show us a kind of precision that no command can simply manufacture. For now, we only need to hold one thing. The failure of forced effort is not weakness, it is misrelation. The hand presses harder because it has lost the bowl. There is another layer in this first problem of pressure. Forced effort usually shortens time. It says the situation must become legible now. The repair must hold now. The conversation must resolve now. The grief must explain itself now. But many situations reveal their structure only after the will has stopped interrupting them. We can think of this as patience, but patience is too mild a word. It is a form of disciplined perception. We wait not because waiting is beautiful, but because premature action would falsify what we are trying to understand. This is why the hand is such a useful beginning. A hand is not abstract. It can tighten before the mind has justified anything. It can reveal our philosophy before we can state it. When the hand clenches, the world is already being treated as resistance. When it opens, the world may still resist, but it is no longer reduced to resistance. We should not sentimentalize the open hand. It can still fail. It can still be too late, but it has recovered something the clenched hand had lost: sensitivity. We also need to notice that forcing often disguises itself as clarity. The person who forces may feel more certain because they have eliminated ambiguity. But ambiguity was part of the situation. They did not solve it, they excluded it. A hard plan can make the mind feel clean while making the action crude. The Daoist suspicion begins here. Perhaps our need for clean action sometimes comes from our inability to tolerate a living situation. For a listener, this is where the topic becomes uncomfortable. We may have admired the wrong thing in ourselves. We may have called ourselves disciplined when we were impatient. We may have called ourselves honest when we were merely forceful. We may have called ourselves decisive when we had stopped listening. Wu Wei is not flattering. It asks whether some of our virtues have become stiff, and because the question is uncomfortable, we will be tempted to run toward a slogan: do less, let go, relax. But that would be another way of escaping. The point is not less action in general. The point is action that has returned to contact. Once we see that, the old contrast between trying and not trying begins to break apart. Why does the Daodejing resist fixed naming before it teaches action? The Daodejing begins by troubling the very instrument we are using now. It warns us about speech. The way that can be spoken is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name. Different translators render the opening differently, and we should not pretend one English phrase has solved the matter. But the gesture is clear enough. The text begins by loosening our grip on language. That is not an ornamental beginning. It is already part of the argument about action. To name something is often to prepare it for use. We name a path so we can follow it. We name a person so we can summon them. We name a problem so we can fix it. Naming can be helpful. Without names, we would be lost in fog. But naming also carries a temptation. Once the name is in our hand, we begin to think the thing itself is in our hand. The Daodejing refuses that comfort. This matters for Wu Wei because a doctrine of non-forcing can itself be forced. We can seize the phrase, we can turn it into a rule, we can say, here is what Lao Tzu means, here is the method, here is the outcome, here is the correct life. And the moment we do that, the teaching has started to betray itself. A teaching about non-grasping has become something grasped. We should also be careful about the name Lao Tzu. It is familiar. It helps us know the world we are entering. But historically the situation is not simple. The Laozi or Daodejing is not best treated as a modern book written by a single recoverable author at a desk, with a fixed biography behind every line. The text appears through a layered history of transmission. Manuscript discoveries and scholarly debate make caution necessary. We can still use the traditional name, but we should hear it with humility. That humility is not academic fussiness. It belongs to the question. If the text itself begins by resisting fixed names, then our treatment of the text should not pretend to possess what it is trying to keep open. We can follow it, we can listen to its images, we can compare translations and interpretations, but we should not turn Laozi into a puppet who speaks our preferred slogan. The first chapter of the Daodejing gives us a way to understand this. The Tao is often translated as way, path, course, or process. None of these words is perfect. Each catches something and misses something. A way can be walked, a course can unfold, a process can move without being an object. But the Tao is not simply a road we can point to on a map. It is not a cosmic personality. It is not a force that rewards us for relaxing. It names inadequately the way reality moves before our concepts freeze it. That is why the opening warning matters. If the world is more fluid than our names, then forced action is already in trouble. Forced action depends on the belief that the situation has been fully captured. It says, I know what this is, I know what it needs, I know what must happen next. The Daodejing begins by making that confidence tremble. We need names anyway. That is part of the difficulty. The text does not stop speaking. It does not burn language down. It uses short sayings, paradoxes, images, political counsel, and bodily metaphors. It names the danger of naming. It teaches while warning us that teaching can mislead. This is not hypocrisy. It is the form of the problem. We have to use the tool while remembering that the tool is not the world. We know this in ordinary life. A diagnosis can help a patient. It can also flatten a person into a category. A political label can clarify a position. It can also prevent us from hearing what someone actually said. A family story can hold memory. It can also trap a child inside an inherited role. Names gather meaning. Then, if we are not careful, they begin to govern perception. The Daodejing wants us to notice that governing power. We do not merely describe the world with language. We often approach the world through language already loaded with demand. If I name a situation as a battle, I will look for enemies. If I name it as a failure, I will search for blame. If I name it as material to optimize, I will miss what cannot be optimized without being damaged. So the text that refuses to be grasped is not avoiding action. It is preparing a different relation to action. Before we move, we have to ask whether our categories have already forced the scene. We have to ask whether the name has become a grip. If it has, then even gentle action may carry coercion inside it. This is why Wu Wei cannot be reduced to a technique. A technique is portable. It travels from case to case. It says, do this, then that. But the whole pressure of this material is toward responsiveness. We can learn patterns. We can study texts. We can practice. Yet at the moment of action, the situation must still be met. There is a lovely discomfort in that. The more we want a clean definition, the more the Daodejing asks what we plan to do with it. Do we want clarity so we can listen better, or possession so we can stop listening? Those are different desires. We often confuse them. The same warning applies to translation. Wu Wei is sometimes rendered as non-action. That phrase can open the door, but it can also close it. If non-action means doing nothing, we have already misunderstood. If effortless action means a state without discipline, we have misunderstood again. If non-doing sounds like passive withdrawal, we have turned a subtle theory of conduct into an inert pose. We have to let the phrase remain difficult for a while. This difficulty is not a failure of the tradition. It may be part of its intelligence. A teaching that could be summarized too neatly would be easy to possess. A teaching that resists possession keeps returning us to attention. We are not allowed to treat Dao, Wu Wei, Siran, or Dai as labels pinned to dead specimens. We have to see how they move through images and situations, so the first forcing habit has to loosen here. The demand that reality submit to our definitions. If we cannot name without grasping, we cannot act without grasping either. The old text does not leave us speechless. It leaves us more careful. It asks us to speak in a way that remembers silence. It asks us to define in a way that remembers excess. It asks us to act in a way that remembers the world is not identical with our plan. That is a hard discipline, and now that naming has been made unstable, the next question becomes sharper. If Wu Wei cannot be held as a simple definition, what does it actually refuse? What does non-action mean if it does not mean doing nothing? The text's resistance to naming also changes how we read authority. If we imagine Lao Tzu as a single sage handing down final answers, we may use that image to stop thinking. The sage said it, so the matter is settled. But the actual textual situation denies us that convenience. We meet a tradition, a title, a set of transmitted sayings, a family of images, and a history of interpretation. We have to participate in judgment. This does not weaken the material. It makes our relation to it more honest. A brittle certainty about the author would be another form of grasping. We can still hear a coherent pressure in the text without pretending every historical question is closed. We can still say the Daodejing pushes against coercive action, celebrates non-contention, praises softness, and worries about over-governance. But we say it as readers, not owners. That readerly humility is itself a training in non-forcing. We allow the text to remain somewhat strange. We do not smooth every paradox. We do not turn every image into a moral rule. We let water be water for a while before converting it into advice. We let the uncarved block unsettle our love of sophistication before deciding exactly what it means. This is slower than extraction. It is also more faithful. There is a practical consequence here. When we approach another person, we often do what bad reading does. We seize a name. Difficult, lazy, controlling, sensitive, brilliant, broken. Once the name lands, perception narrows around it. The person may still be more than the name, but we have stopped expecting surprise. We are now acting on an interpretation that may have become possession. The Daodejing's opening warning therefore reaches into ethics. To name responsibly is to remember that the name is partial. To plan responsibly is to remember that the plan is partial. To act responsibly is to remember that the situation is more than the description under which we first met it. That is not vagueness, it is accuracy. So before Wu Wei becomes a doctrine of action, it becomes a discipline of not mistaking our first grasp for reality. We need that discipline because the next phrase, non-action, is almost guaranteed to be misunderstood if we seize it too quickly. What does non-action mean if it does not mean doing nothing? The phrase Wu Wei can mislead us almost immediately. If we hear non-action, we imagine someone sitting still while the world burns. If we hear effortless action, we imagine a secret state where everything comes easily. If we hear non-doing, we imagine laziness wearing a robe of depth. None of this is enough. In the Daodejing, Wu Wei is tied to efficacy. Things are done, the sage responds, the ruler governs. Difficult matters are handled before they become unmanageable. The text does not admire paralysis. It is not fascinated by absence for its own sake. The puzzle is that action can happen without the aggressive contrivance we usually mistake for agency, so we should begin with a plain distinction. Inactivity is the absence of movement. Passivity is the refusal to enter the responsibility of a situation. Wu Wei is neither. It is action released from coercive imposition. Sometimes that release looks like restraint, sometimes it looks like quick movement, sometimes it looks like letting a process already underway complete itself without our anxious interference. A doctor who does not prescribe unnecessary medicine is not doing nothing. A musician who leaves silence around a phrase is not doing nothing. A judge who refuses to decide before hearing the case is not doing nothing. In each case, restraint is part of the action. It protects the situation from premature force. We need examples like these because the word non-action keeps pulling the mind toward emptiness. But early Daoist thought is rarely empty in that simple sense. It is full of rivers, valleys, rulers, infants, blocks of wood, doors, wheels, bellows, blades, and trees. These images keep returning us to forms of activity that do not look like conquest. They ask us to imagine agency less as a fist and more as a fitting. A fitting is not passive. A key fits a lock by being shaped to it. A boat fits a current by moving with conditions rather than denying them. A craftsperson fits a tool to material by learning where the resistance is real and where it is only clumsy pressure. In each case, action works because it is not merely the projection of will. It has learned something from what it meets. That learning is what separates Wu Wei from surrender. Surrender, in the shallow sense, gives up the field. It says the world will do what it does and we need not answer. Wu Wei does not remove answerability, it changes the mode of answer. It asks whether the response can arise from contact rather than command. The Daodejing often pushes this through paradox. It speaks of acting without acting, teaching without words, doing without claiming. These phrases are not riddles meant to impress us, they are attempts to name a recognizable experience. Sometimes the most effective action is not the one that advertises itself. Sometimes a person creates room for something to occur by not centering their own agency in the scene. Parents know this. Teachers know this. Anyone who has cared for another person knows it. There are moments when advice becomes pressure, when instruction becomes noise, when help becomes a way of taking over. The person who refrains may be doing the more difficult thing. They are holding back not because they do not care, but because care has learnt its limit. This is where the moral seriousness of Wu Wei appears. If we misread it as laziness, we miss the demand it places on us. It requires enough attention to know when intervention would distort. It requires enough humility to recognize that not every good intention deserves immediate expression. It requires enough courage to let a situation show itself before we make it conform to us. Yet the doctrine cannot be reduced to caution. Sometimes Wu Wei moves. The Zhuangzi will later give us skilled bodies that act with extraordinary precision. The Daodejing itself speaks of handling the difficult while it is still easy and the large while it is still small. That is not a counsel of delay, it is a counsel of timing. Act before the knot hardens, move before the crisis demands violence. Enter lightly enough that the situation can still respond. This is a very different picture from heroic will. Heroic will loves the dramatic moment. It arrives when the knot is already tight, cuts through resistance, and takes credit for force. Daoist non-action often works earlier and more quietly. It attends to beginnings. It notices the slight turning before the collapse. It prefers a small adjustment before a grand intervention. The action may be less visible because it has not waited for disaster. That invisibility creates another problem. We may not know how to honor it. Cultures built around visible achievement often mistake quiet effectiveness for absence. The ruler who interferes constantly seems active. The ruler whose restraint allows ordinary life to settle may seem to have done nothing. The teacher who fills every silence seems diligent. The teacher who lets the student discover something may seem less impressive. Wu Wei is hard to recognize because it does not always perform itself as effort. We should not romanticize hiddenness. Invisible action can conceal neglect. A leader who refuses to act while people suffer is not suddenly a sage because they use Daoist language. That is why we keep returning to responsiveness. The question is not whether action is visible. The question is whether it answers the situation. Neglect does not answer, it withdraws. Coercion does not answer, it imposes. Wu Wei answers without domination. This answer is not mechanical. No list can tell us in advance exactly when to speak, when to wait, when to intervene, or when to let a process unfold. That is frustrating. We often want philosophy to give us a lever, but this philosophy keeps removing levers that would let us escape attention. It does not say, always do less. It says, stop assuming more force is more wisdom. There is another reason Wu Wei cannot mean mere inaction. The early Daoist critique is directed not only at individuals, but at forms of social and political overreach. If a ruler governs by multiplying rules, punishments, and clever schemes, the society may become more anxious and less ordered. Non-action here is not private passivity, it is a critique of power that cannot stop touching everything. That political meaning should protect us from the spa version of the idea. Wu Wei is not a mood. It is not a calming background. It is an argument about action under constraint. It asks what happens when the will, whether personal or institutional, stops believing that domination is the only form of efficacy. The answer is not that nothing happens. Something may happen for the first time. The action may become less theatrical and more exact. The repair may hold because the hand stopped trembling with its own demand. The conversation may open because speech stopped trying to win. The ruler may serve order by refusing the vanity of constant interference. So when we hear non-action, we have to hear a refusal inside it, not refusal of responsibility, refusal of coercive action, not refusal of effort, refusal of effort that has lost contact, not refusal of the world, refusal to turn the world into a mirror of the will. That is why the strongest image of Wu Wei is not a person doing nothing, it is water moving. One way to hear Wu Wei is to think about timing. In many situations, doing the right thing at the wrong time makes it wrong in practice. A truthful sentence can become cruelty if spoken at the moment when it can only wound. A necessary reform can fail if imposed before anyone understands the need. A repair can be ruined if touched before the glue has set. Non-action often means refusing the false urgency that makes action premature, but waiting is not automatically wise. This is where the doctrine keeps its edge. Waiting can be attentive or it can be evasive. The difference is whether the situation is being more fully perceived or merely avoided. The person practicing Wu Wei is not watching life from a safe distance. They are present enough to sense when movement becomes fitting. That word fitting may be more useful than effortless. Effortless can mislead us into imagining ease. Fitting suggests relation. A fitting action may require strain. It may require courage. It may require years of discipline. But its force is not blind. It fits the opening, the material, the need, the moment. When it moves, it does not have to crush as much, because it has not ignored as much. The Daodejing also connects Wu Wei with not claiming. The sage acts and does not possess the result. This is another way action avoids domination. We can force not only before the act, but after it, by needing ownership, praise, control of the narrative. We do a good thing and then make the goodness serve our image. The act may have helped, but the relation is quietly repossessed by the ego. Non-action therefore includes a strange humility after action. The work is done, and the self does not have to stand over it like a conqueror. We know how rare this is. Many people can act generously, fewer can resist turning generosity into a claim. The Daodejing's sage is difficult not because he never moves, but because his movement is not organized around possession. This helps us avoid the dead reading of Wu Wei. The doctrine is not a blank, it includes timing, fit, restraint, movement, non-possession, and responsiveness. It asks action to become less noisy around itself. Why does Laozi return to water and softness? Water is easy to misunderstand because it has become too available as a symbol. We have heard people say flow so often that the word barely touches anything. It can mean relaxation, mood, flexibility, or a vague approval of whatever happens. But the water of the Daodejing is not vague, it is doing philosophical work. Water moves, it descends, it yields to shape. It goes to low places that people often despise. It does not compete with the stone, yet over time it changes the stone. Its softness is not the same as weakness. Its refusal to contend is not the same as absence. Water gives the text an image of action that does not need the posture of domination. We should look at that slowly. A rock in a stream does not persuade the water to stop. The water does not take offense. It does not stiffen itself into a second rock. It divides, turns, curls, thins, gathers, and continues. The movement is not random, it is shaped by contact. The water has direction but not rigidity. It is responsive without being passive. That is the point. When the Daodejing praises water, it is not telling us to become shapeless in the sense of having no commitments. It is asking why we confuse strength with resistance to influence. A thing can be strong because it refuses to bend. A thing can also be strong because it can bend without breaking. The text repeatedly presses this contrast. The hard and stiff belong to death. The soft and flexible belong to life. We do not need to turn that into a universal law. We only need to feel the pressure it places on our usual admiration for hardness. Hardness reassures us. It looks clear. It looks decisive. It can be measured by how much it resists. But living things are rarely strongest when they are most rigid. A tree that cannot bend snaps in wind. A body that cannot relax loses speed. A mind that cannot revise itself mistakes stubbornness for integrity. Water challenges the pride of fixed form. This is why non-contention matters. To not compete does not mean to have no effect. It means refusing the terms of a contest that would make us imitate what opposes us. If the stone is hard, water does not become harder. If the valley is low, water does not seek the highest place in order to prove its worth. It acts from its own character. It remains water. That phrase, from its own character, brings us close to Zira, often translated as naturalness or self-so. We should be careful with the word natural. It does not mean whatever impulse happens to arise. Cruelty can feel natural to someone. Laziness can feel natural. Habit can disguise itself as nature. In this context, Ziran points toward things moving according to their own character, not under the distortion of imposed artifice. Water is not pretending to be humble, it simply goes where water goes. Human beings are not water, that is important. The image is not a command to dissolve all judgment. We have language, memory, obligation, and conflict. We live among other people. We are answerable for what we do. So the water image has to be translated carefully into human life. It does not say, abandon discernment. It asks whether our discernment has become rigid before the situation has spoken. In conversation, water might mean not meeting accusation with immediate accusation. In craft, it might mean following the grain. In leadership, it might mean letting local knowledge matter before issuing commands. In grief, it might mean not forcing the heart to move on a schedule invented by pride. None of these is passive. Each asks for a different kind of strength. The low place is part of that strength. The Daodejing often values what stands beneath, behind, or below. Valleys, hollows, empty spaces, the female, the infant, the uncarved block. These images resist the social hunger to occupy the highest position. Water benefits things and does not contend, one translation says. It remains in places people dislike. The point is not humiliation. The point is freedom from the anxious need to dominate the field. A person obsessed with rank cannot practice this. Every encounter becomes a test of position. Every criticism becomes a threat. Every delay becomes an insult. The will has to harden itself repeatedly to preserve its imagined height. Water shows another possibility. It can go low because it is not trying to prove it is high. This has political implications too. A ruler who must appear powerful at every moment may become destructive. They will intervene to display control. They will punish to display authority. They will speak to fill silence. The water-like ruler, if such a thing is possible, would not need constant self-advertisement. Their power would be measured less by visible pressure and more by whether life under them can breathe. We should not idealize this too easily. Political restraint can be wise. It can also be negligence dressed in poetry. Early Daoist texts do not map cleanly onto modern institutions' rights or crises. We should not pretend they solve questions they did not ask, but their suspicion remains useful. Power that always needs to harden may be less secure than it looks. Water also helps us understand why Wu Wei can be effective without being controlling. A forced action tries to determine every outcome in advance. A water-like action works with tendencies. It finds the lower channel. It does not waste itself proving that the rock should not be there. It adjusts without surrendering movement. There is a discipline in that. We often think adjustment is compromise in the weak sense, but adjustment can be intelligence. The sailor adjusts to wind not because they worship wind, but because denial will not move the boat. The physician adjusts treatment to the patient not because truth is relative, but because bodies are particular. The speaker adjusts words to the listener not because conviction is gone, but because communication is not conquest. Water also acts over time. This matters because forcing is often impatient. It wants the dramatic result now. It wants the stone split by command. Water teaches another temporality. It can be patient without being inert. It can be persistent without being aggressive. It can wear down hardness not by copying hardness, but by remaining faithful to its own mode. That is a strange kind of power. The modern slogan would say, just flow. But the Daodejing's water is not a slogan. It is a rebuke to our limited imagination of action. It asks why we trust only the movement that announces itself as force. It asks why we think yielding must mean defeat. It asks whether strength might sometimes appear as adaptability, lowliness, and endurance. By the end of the water image, we can see Wu Wei more clearly. It is not empty stillness, it is movement without rivalry. It is action shaped by contact. It is direction without rigidity. It is power that does not need to call itself powerful. And once this image enters the political world, the question becomes sharper. If water does not compete, what would it mean for a ruler to stop competing with the life of the people? The water image also helps us think about conflict without worshipping conflict. A culture of hardness often assumes that every encounter is a contest of wills. If I yield, you win. If I bend, I lose. If I go low, I am humiliated. Water refuses this entire theater. It does not accept the stone's definition of strength. It does not become a rival stone in order to prove itself real. This refusal can be powerful in ordinary life. There are arguments that survive only because both people keep accepting the same battlefield. Each answer hardens the next. Each defense confirms the need for attack. A water-like response does not mean agreeing falsely. It means declining the form of combat that would make understanding impossible. Sometimes the only way to preserve truth is to stop speaking in the shape the conflict demands. But again, this is not a universal rule. Some conflicts must be entered. Some evasions call themselves peace because peace sounds noble. Water does not teach us to avoid all resistance. It teaches us to ask whether resistance has determined our form too completely. If the opponent's hardness makes us hard in the same way, the opponent has already shaped us. The low place also carries an ethical challenge. To go low is to give up the demand to be seen as central. Much coercive action comes from injured centrality. We force because we want our role, our plan, our wound, or our intelligence to dominate the scene. Water's lowliness asks whether action can serve without standing at the center of its own service. This is why the image belongs beside the doctrine of non-contention. Non-contention is not cowardice. It is freedom from the need to convert every encounter into proof. A person who no longer needs to prove superiority can sometimes act with extraordinary clarity. They can apologize without collapse. They can change course without shame. They can let another person be right without feeling erased. That kind of softness is not easy. It may be one of the hardest strengths. It requires enough security to be affected by the world without immediately defending the self against affection. Water looks simple because it has no ego to protect. Human beings do. So for us, water becomes not an identity, but a discipline of loosening the defensive shape we bring into every room. What does Wu Wei mean politically? It is tempting to keep Wu Wei inside the private life. We want to imagine the tired person, the overworked mind, the hand that presses too hard. That is part of the story. But the early Daoist materials are also speaking into a world of rulers, wars, punishments, rituals, taxes, schemes, and competing visions of order. Wu Wei is not only a mood of the individual, it is also a suspicion about power. The historical setting matters. The Warring States period was not a calm philosophical retreat. It was a time of conflict and consolidation, where thinkers argued about how order could be restored. Some trusted ritual, some trusted law, some trusted moral education, some trusted punishment, administration, and force. Against this background, the Daodejing's counsel can sound almost impossible. Govern by not over-governing, act by not imposing. Let the people become simple again. We should not flatten this into a modern political program. The text is not a contemporary policy manual. It does not map neatly onto libertarianism, progressivism, conservatism, or any modern state theory. But it does ask a question that survives translation across time. When does intervention create the disorder it was meant to prevent? The Daodejing suggests that a ruler obsessed with control may multiply the very problems that justify control. More prohibitions can produce more cunning. More display of cleverness can make people more restless. More coercive order can make social life more artificial. The ruler tightens the net, then points to the trapped movement as proof that the net was necessary. We know the pattern. A workplace adds procedures because trust has declined. The procedures make every action defensive. Trust declines further. A school responds to disorder with surveillance so total that students learn obedience without judgment. A family tries to prevent conflict by controlling every word, and the silence becomes another kind of conflict. None of these examples is the ancient state, but they help us feel the problem. Over-control can manufacture the evidence for itself. This is why the ruler who does less is not necessarily absent. The point is not that governance disappears. The point is that the ruler refuses to turn every living relation into an object of manipulation. The best ruler in some Daodejing passages is barely known. The people say, "We did it ourselves." That is not a fantasy of leaderlessness so much as a rebuke to vanity. Good order may not need to advertise the ruler's hand. Here again, visibility misleads us. A ruler who constantly acts looks strong. Edicts multiply, officials move, punishments appear. The court feels busy, but busyness is not wisdom. A ruler who restrains unnecessary interference may seem inactive, yet may preserve forms of life that coercive order would damage. The question is not how much power is displayed. The question is what power does to the field it enters. This political Wu Wei has a severe edge. It is not simply kindness. It distrusts the ruler's desire to improve people by force. It distrusts moral vanity in government. It distrusts clever policies that treat life as material for design. That does not mean all design is bad. It means that the will to design can become intoxicated with itself. Once intoxicated, it stops hearing the people it claims to serve. The Daodejing often links this with simplicity. Again, we have to be careful. Simplicity does not mean ignorance, and it certainly should not be romanticized as poverty or deprivation. The text's suspicion is aimed at artificial desire, competitive display, and the endless multiplication of wants that make people governable through anxiety. The ruler who does less is not merely reducing paperwork, he is refusing to inflame the conditions that require coercive management. This can be uncomfortable because we may prefer philosophies that tell us exactly how to fix society. Daoist political thought often refuses that confidence. It asks whether the fixing impulse has already been corrupted by domination. It asks whether order imposed from above can lose contact with the living rhythms below. It asks whether the ruler's knowledge is as complete as the ruler imagines. There is danger here. We have to name it. Non-interference can become a shelter for injustice. If people are being harmed, a ruler who does nothing cannot simply claim wisdom. If institutions neglect suffering, the language of restraint becomes obscene. Early Daoist texts do not give us a modern theory of rights or intervention. They do not solve every political problem, but they do expose a danger that activist confidence can miss. There are interventions that make the intervener feel righteous while making the world worse. There are reforms that treat the people as clay. There are policies that assume resistance proves only ignorance, never that the policy itself has failed to understand the texture of life. Wu Wei asks power to doubt itself before it acts. That doubt is not paralysis. It is discipline. The ruler who does less must still perceive. They must know when a small movement now prevents a violent movement later. The Daodejing's counsel to handle things while they are small belongs here. A wise action may be early, quiet, and almost invisible. It may prevent a crisis precisely by refusing the dramatic interventions that create one. This changes our picture of political strength. The coercive ruler seeks obedience. The responsive ruler seeks conditions in which life can order itself as far as possible. The coercive ruler needs credit. The responsive ruler can disappear from the center of the story. The coercive ruler fears the unplanned. The responsive ruler knows that not everything living can be commanded without being damaged. We can see why this would have sounded strange in a world of competing states. To survive, rulers needed armies, administration, and strategy. The Daoist voice does not remove that reality. It speaks against the spiritual inflation of control. It says, be careful. The more completely you try to master the world, the more artificial and brittle your order may become. This is not only ancient politics. It is a question about any place where one will govern many lives. A company, a classroom, a household, a state, a religious community. The more power a person has, the more tempting it becomes to confuse the reach of command with the depth of understanding. Wu Wei tells power that the world is not understood merely because it can be touched. So when the ruler does less, the meaning is not simple withdrawal. It is a refusal to make power theatrical. It is government without the vanity of constant interference. It is order sought through conditions rather than domination. It is a hard suspicion of the belief that the world improves in proportion to how tightly we grip it, and yet the political image remains abstract until we see non-forcing in a body. The ruler can disappear into aphorism, a skilled hand cannot. So now we turn from the court to the workshop, from edicts to the blade, from command to a form of action that has practiced so long it no longer needs to announce itself. The political dimension also clarifies why Wu Wei is not merely private spirituality. If the idea applied only to inner calm, it would be easier and smaller. But the Daodejing keeps asking what happens when power itself practices non-forcing. That question is unsettling because power usually wants to be seen. It wants ceremonies, signatures, announcements, visible victories, and visible obedience. A ruler who does less threatens the vanity of rule. If things go well, the ruler cannot claim every success as personal achievement. If the people say, "We did it ourselves," the ruler's ego receives less food. This may be why non-interference is so difficult for institutions. It is not only a technical strategy, it is a spiritual humiliation for command. We can see this in smaller forms of authority. A good editor may leave a sentence alone. A good mentor may ask one question and let the student do the work. A good organizer may create conditions in which others can act without needing constant permission. In each case, authority is present, but it is not occupying all the space. This is a different kind of effectiveness from control. Control wants compliance. Condition-making wants life to become capable. Control often creates dependence because dependence proves control was needed. Condition-making may reduce the visible importance of the one who made the conditions. That is why it requires a less possessive relation to power. The danger, of course, is that condition-making can become a polite word for neglect. We should keep saying this because it is the easiest corruption of the doctrine. A ruler who leaves people exposed to exploitation is not practicing Wu Wei. A manager who provides no guidance and calls it empowerment is not wise. A parent who refuses responsibility is not non-coercive. They are absent. The test is whether life under the authority becomes more responsive, more capable, and less distorted by fear. If doing less merely transfers burden to the vulnerable, it has failed. If doing less reduces unnecessary domination and allows real order to emerge, then we begin to understand why the Daodejing took political non-action seriously. How can action be effortless after long cultivation? The Zhuangzi gives us one of the most vivid images in all of Daoist literature. Cook Ding cutting up an ox. We should remember the source carefully. This is not the Daodejing speaking in Laozi's voice. It is a related Daoist text, layered and strange, using story to pressure our usual categories. But for the question of Wu Wei, the story is indispensable. Cook Ding does not hack. He does not force the blade through bone. He moves through spaces. His knife follows the natural openings in the animal. After years of practice, he says he no longer sees with the eyes in the ordinary way. Spirit or bodily awareness moves where perception once strained. The blade remains sharp because it does not collide with what it should not cut. The story can sound mystical if we hear it lazily. It is not laziness, it is not magic. Cook Ding is skilled because he has trained. He has spent years with bodies, joints, resistance, and timing. The effortless quality of his action is the fruit of long attention. What disappears is not discipline. What disappears is the noisy, self-conscious forcing that gets in the way of skill. Anyone who has learned a craft knows this transition. At first, the learner is full of commands. Put the hand here, move the wrist there, remember the rule, watch the line. Do not slip. Everything is effort because nothing has yet settled into the body. Then, slowly, some actions become available without being shouted internally. The musician no longer thinks each note in isolation. The carpenter hears the wood. The dancer stops counting and begins to move. We should not romanticize this as pure instinct. It is cultivated spontaneity. That phrase contains the paradox. Spontaneity sounds untrained, cultivation sounds deliberate. Yet much human excellence lives exactly there. We practice so that, in the moment, action can become less burdened by the self that is trying to control it. Coercive shows why Wu Wei cannot mean doing nothing. His action is precise, active, and responsive. The blade moves, the body works, the ox is cut. But the action does not impose itself blindly. It follows openings. It honors the structure it meets. It uses less force because it understands more. This is a profound reversal of our usual admiration. We often admire the person who overcomes resistance by sheer will. The story admires the person who does not create unnecessary resistance in the first place. The blade that remains sharp is not heroic in the ordinary sense. It survives because it avoids collision. It is effective because it is not vain. There is a lesson here about knowledge. Coercive's knowledge is not merely verbal. He could not hand someone a simple instruction sheet and make them equally skilled. This is where another Zhuangzi story, wheelwright Pian, becomes useful. The old wheelwright tells a ruler that the finest skill cannot be fully transmitted in words. Too loose, and the wheel will not hold. Too tight, and it will not fit. The right touch lives in the hand. This does not mean words are useless. We are using words now. The Zhuangzi uses words brilliantly, but it means that action often depends on forms of understanding that exceed explicit rule. A rule can guide practice. It cannot replace contact. The body has to learn the difference between pressure that works and pressure that damages. We can bring this back to the question of forcing. The beginner forces because the beginner does not yet perceive enough. Force compensates for lack of contact. The expert uses less visible effort not because the task is less demanding, but because the expert has become more intimate with the task structure. The action is quieter because perception is deeper. This matters for ethics too. We sometimes want moral life to work like a rulebook. Learn the principle, apply the principle, produce the right action. Principles matter, but the lived moment often requires judgment that cannot be reduced to a formula. How much truth can this person hear right now? When does patience become enabling? When does intervention become domination? When does silence protect, and when does it betray? These are not questions a rigid will answers well. Wu Wei, read through skill, suggests that wise action may require training perception, not simply restraining desire, not merely relaxing, training perception. We learn to see openings, we learn to feel timing. We learn to distinguish the resistance that asks for firmness from the resistance that warns us we are pushing wrongly. There is a danger in celebrating skill. Skilled action can become arrogance. The person who has mastered one domain may imagine they have mastered life. They may turn their ease into a claim of superiority. Daoist stories often undercut that temptation by choosing humble figures. Cooks, wheelwrights, swimmers, craftsmen. The point is not prestige, it is embodied responsiveness. The story also complicates the idea of self. In forced action, the self stands in front of the act. It narrates, demands, monitors, and claims. In skilled action, the self becomes less obtrusive. The work is still being done by someone. But that someone is not constantly interrupting the work with the need to possess it. This is why the action can feel effortless. The effort has not vanished, it has been reorganized. We should be careful not to turn this into modern performance psychology. The territory is adjacent, but the promise of this inquiry is not a flow state hack. We are not mining Taoism for productivity. We are asking a philosophical question about action. What kind of agency remains when the commanding self becomes less central? Coercive gives one answer, a trained responsiveness that moves with the grain of things. That answer is beautiful. It is also unstable. Because once we hear that spontaneity can be cultivated, a new problem appears. Can we intentionally train ourselves not to force, or does the very project of becoming effortless become another form of effortful control? The knife moves easily. The student watching it may immediately decide to become effortless, and at that moment the trap closes. Coercing also changes how we think about freedom. We often imagine freedom as the absence of constraint. The skilled cook suggests another possibility. He is free not because there is no structure, but because he understands the structure so intimately that he no longer collides with it. The joints and spaces do not imprison his action. They make precise action possible. This is a crucial correction. Non-forcing does not mean acting as though limits do not exist. It means becoming so attentive to limits that movement can happen through them. The beginner resents limits because limits interrupt desire. The expert studies limits until they become the path. This is why the blade survives. It has stopped treating the world as an obstacle to the self. There is humility in skill because the material is always teaching. A violin does not yield its sound to intention alone. Wood does not accept every cut. A body does not heal on our schedule. A conversation does not open because we planned the right sequence of points. The skilled person has learned to let the thing itself participate in the action. This participation is hard to describe in modern language because we often divide agency too sharply. Either I act or the world acts on me. Either I control or I submit. Coercing troubles that division. His action is his, but it is also guided by the structure he meets. He is neither a passive instrument nor an isolated commander. He is responsive agency embodied. That phrase may sound technical, but the experience is ordinary. We know moments when action seems to find its path because we finally stop interrupting it. We know moments when a sentence arrives only after we stop forcing the sentence. We know moments when a problem yields not to pressure, but to a slight change in angle. These are small glimpses of the same structure. The story therefore gives Wu Wei a body. Without the body, non-forcing can float into abstraction. With a body, we see that the doctrine concerns trained perception, timing, and contact. It is not less real because it cannot be fully reduced to instructions. It may be more real for that reason. Much of life is lived at the level where the hand knows before the theory catches up. Can someone intentionally become spontaneous without turning spontaneity into a project? This may be the central paradox of Wu Wei. The moment we admire effortless action, we want to produce it. We want the method. We want the steps. We want to become the kind of person who does not force. But wanting not to force can itself become a new form of forcing. We know this pattern intimately. Try to fall asleep. Try to be relaxed. Try to sound natural. Try to stop caring what people think. Try to be spontaneous in a room where everyone is watching. The command makes the state harder to reach. The will turns toward itself and becomes cramped. That is why Edward Slingerland's phrase, "trying not to try," has become so useful in modern discussions of Wu Wei. It names the absurdity without dissolving it. We cannot simply command spontaneity, yet we also do not become wise by refusing all cultivation. Somewhere between manufactured ease and abandoned effort, a different path has to be found. The early Chinese traditions did not agree on this path. Some approaches trusted ritual practice to shape people until right action became second nature. Daoist materials often looked at ritual and explicit moral effort with suspicion, fearing that performance would replace naturalness. But Taoism itself does not escape the paradox. If the Daodejing tells us to return, simplify, soften, and stop contending, we can turn every one of those into a project of self-management. This is where Ziran becomes important. The word points toward naturalness, spontaneity, self-sowing. It suggests things being so from themselves, moving according to their own character rather than under a coercive overlay. But as soon as a person says, "I will now become natural," the problem begins. The self steps in as manager of naturalness. It tries to supervise spontaneity into existence. We can see the comedy of this. A person sits by water and tries very hard to look unforced. They monitor the body, soften the voice, cultivate a gentle expression, and perform detachment. Nothing is wrong with wanting calm. But the performance of non-forcing is still forcing. It has merely changed costume. The Daodejing's language of decreasing can help. In one chapter, learning is associated with daily increase, while the pursuit of Tao is associated with daily decrease. Again, translations vary, and we should not build too much on a single English phrasing. But the contrast matters. Some forms of cultivation add techniques, concepts, and controls. Another form may involve removing the compulsions that prevent responsiveness. This is not the same as doing nothing. Decreasing can be a discipline. It can mean subtracting vanity from speech, subtracting unnecessary intervention from leadership, subtracting the need to win from conversation, subtracting the story that only visible strain counts as sincerity. Each subtraction may require attention and practice, but the practice is not aimed at creating a more impressive self. It is aimed at making the self less obstructive. That is hard. We often prefer addition because addition feels like progress. More knowledge, more tools, more plans, more identity. Decrease can feel like loss. It asks us to give up the part of ourselves that wants to stand over the situation as master. But if the master is the source of distortion, giving it less room may be the beginning of better action. Still, the paradox remains. Who does the decreasing? Who decides which desires are artificial and which belong to the living situation? Who prevents simplicity from becoming another aesthetic of superiority? We should not pretend the text gives an easy answer. Its refusal of rigid formula is part of its honesty. Perhaps the best we can say is this: Wu Wei cannot be pursued directly as an achievement. The more we grasp it as a state to possess, the more it recedes, but we can cultivate conditions in which non-forcing becomes more likely. We can practice listening. We can notice when our will has become frantic. We can study crafts that punish excessive pressure. We can allow silence before speech. We can become familiar with the feeling of a clenched hand opening. The difference is subtle but important. We are not manufacturing spontaneity. We are removing some of the interferences that block it. A garden is not forced to grow by shouting at the soil. But it is not abandoned either. It is watered, cleared, protected, and given conditions. The growth is not commanded, it is allowed. This image is imperfect, as all images are. Human beings are not gardens, but it helps us avoid two mistakes. The first mistake says, I can engineer non-forcing through technique. The second says, any deliberate cultivation is already false. The middle possibility is condition making. We act around the possibility without trying to seize the result directly. This has consequences for moral life. If I want to become less reactive, I cannot simply order myself to be unreactive at the moment of insult. The order may become another reaction. But I can learn my patterns. I can slow certain environments. I can practice hearing criticism before defending. I can repair after failure. Over time, the space between stimulus and action may change. The action that later seems effortless was prepared by many small, indirect disciplines. The Zhuangzi's skill stories fit here. Cook Ding did not become effortless by deciding one morning to stop trying. He practiced until perception changed. The effort moved underground. The body learned. The self stopped shouting instructions because the work had entered a deeper register. Trying not to try did not mean refusing practice. It meant reaching a form of practice that eventually releases the grip of practice. But there is no guarantee. We may practice wrongly. We may become proud of our simplicity. We may use the language of naturalness to avoid criticism. We may treat other people's pain as an unfortunate disturbance to our cultivated calm. Every serious philosophy has its corruptions. Daoist non-forcing is no exception. That is why the test cannot be how spiritual or relaxed we appear. The test has to return to relation. Does the action meet the situation more truthfully? Does it reduce unnecessary coercion? Does it remain answerable? Does it make contact possible? If not, then our non-forcing may be another form of self-display. The paradox of trying not to try keeps the doctrine humble. It prevents us from turning Wu Wei into a possession. The person who says, "I have become effortless," may already have lost the thread. The more honest posture is quieter. We notice moments when force recedes and action becomes clearer. We study them, we do not own them. And then the Zhuangzi takes another step. It asks whether even our language of usefulness may be part of the grip. Perhaps the will to make every life, every action, every tree useful is another way of forcing the world into our purposes. So we leave the student trying not to try, and we walk toward an old tree no carpenter wants. The paradox of trying not to try has a social dimension. We do not merely force ourselves privately. We are often trained by institutions to force ourselves. We learn to monitor expression, optimize time, perform sincerity, brand our rest, measure our attention, and convert even inner life into a project. Under those conditions, the command to be natural can become another task on the list. This is why the Daoist suspicion of artificiality still has force. Artificiality does not mean everything cultural is bad. Human beings are cultural creatures. Language, practice, ritual, education, and memory shape us. The problem is not formation as such. The problem is formation that cuts us off from responsiveness and then calls the resulting stiffness virtue. We may become excellent performers of ourselves. We may know how to appear calm, moral, productive, open, or wise. But performance can replace contact. A person performing calm may be unable to hear anger. A person performing humility may be unable to receive correction. A person performing effortlessness may be exhausted by the performance. The self becomes a carefully managed surface. Wu Wei presses against that surface. It asks whether action can arise from a less divided place, not from impulse alone, not from raw authenticity, which can be another myth, but from a cultivated alignment in which the person is not constantly managing the appearance of being a person. This is why indirect cultivation matters. We cannot simply tear off performance and become pure. That fantasy is itself performative. But we can notice where the performance tightens the hand. We can notice where wanting to appear good prevents us from doing the good thing. We can notice where the project of self-improvement has become another form of self-occupation. The old language of decreasing becomes useful again. Less display, less grasping, less need to convert every silence into proof, less hunger to possess the result. These are not dramatic achievements, they are small freedoms. Over time, they may allow action to become less crowded by the self that wants to manage it. What does Taoism gain by questioning usefulness? In the Zhuangzi, a huge tree stands by the road. It is old, twisted, and useless by ordinary standards. Its wood is no good for boards. Its branches will not make proper beams. A carpenter passes it and dismisses it. Because it is useless, no one has cut it down. Because no one has cut it down, it has lived out its years and become vast enough to shelter others. The story is strange because usefulness usually sounds like praise. We want useful tools, useful ideas, useful people, useful time. To be useful is to fit a purpose. It is to be capable of being taken into a plan. Much of life requires this. A tool that cannot cut is a poor knife. A bridge that cannot carry weight is a failed bridge. The Zhuangzi is not asking us to despise function. It is asking what happens when function becomes the only measure of value. A useful tree is noticed by the carpenter. It is measured, cut, shaped, transported, and used. Its value becomes the reason for its destruction. The useless tree escapes because it does not fit the available purposes. Its crookedness is a protection. Its refusal to become material for someone else's plan allows it to remain alive. This is not a simple celebration of idleness. The tree is not heroic because it accomplishes nothing. It reveals the violence hidden inside certain kinds of usefulness. To call a thing useful may be to honor it. It may also be to reduce it to the role it can play in our design. We can feel this beyond trees. A person can be praised as useful until they are exhausted. A piece of land can be called useful only when extracted from. A child can be valued for performance until their life becomes a project. Even time can be forced into usefulness so completely that rest begins to look like guilt. The language of usefulness can become a net. The Zhuangzi loves figures who slip through nets. Useless trees, odd bodies, marginal people, strange animals, perspectives that refuse the official scale. These stories do not give us a neat doctrine. They disturb the obvious. They ask us to imagine value outside capture. How does this connect to Wu Wei? Forcing often begins with a purpose that cannot tolerate anything outside itself. The will arrives with a use already prepared. It sees the world according to the plan. The tree is lumber, the silence is awkwardness, the river is an obstacle, the person is a role. Once the use is fixed, action becomes extraction. Non-forcing loosens that. It does not abolish purpose. We still build houses, we still cook food, we still make decisions, but it asks whether purpose has become so total that the being of the thing disappears. The useless tree reminds us that not everything valuable announces itself by serving our immediate design. There is a political version of this too. States often value people by function: soldier, farmer, taxpayer, official, laborer, subject. Modern institutions do the same in different words: consumer, employee, user, metric, output. These categories can organize life, they can also flatten it. A Daoist suspicion asks what forms of life become possible only when people are not endlessly forced into usefulness. We should avoid making uselessness into a romantic pose. Some people are denied usefulness by injustice, some are excluded from meaningful participation and then told to call it freedom. That is not what we are praising. The Zhuangzi's point is sharper. It asks whether the dominant standards of usefulness are themselves coercive. It asks whether survival sometimes depends on not fitting the shape demanded by power. The old tree also changes our sense of action. Its action is not dramatic. It stands, it shelters, it persists outside the carpenter's intention. In a world obsessed with projects, persistence can look like nothing. But the shade under the tree is real. The life preserved by not being cut is real. The refusal to be reduced to material has consequences. This should make us hear the phrase, "Stop forcing life differently." Life is forced not only by pressure in the moment, it is forced by the categories of value we impose before the moment arrives. If only useful things count, then everything is already under command. The will does not need to shout. The measure has done the violence quietly. Zhuangzi's uselessness also protects us from turning Wu Wei into productivity advice. A modern self-help reading might say, "Do less so you can achieve more." The useless tree says something more disruptive. It asks whether achievement, as we currently measure it, is part of the trap. It does not offer a better productivity system. It questions the hunger to justify existence by productivity at all. That is why the tree belongs in a serious documentary about action. It broadens the question from how to act effectively to what our standards of effectiveness have already done to us. If action is always judged by visible output, non-forcing will look like failure. If value is always tied to usefulness, a life that cannot be optimized will look wasted. The Daoist stories refuse that reduction. We can bring this back to the hand. The woman repairing the bowl may fail because she wants the repair too badly, but she may also fail because she sees the bowl only as an object that must be restored to function. If she saw it differently, the crack might not be an enemy in the same way. This does not mean she should not repair it. It means the relation could change. The will would no longer approach the object only through the demand that it become useful again. There is tenderness in that, but not sentimentality. A thing can be broken and still not be merely a problem. A person can be unproductive and still not be a failure. A tree can be useless and still shelter a life. Daoist thought often opens this space by refusing the obvious hierarchy between useful and useless, but because this idea is tender, it is easy to flatten. The market loves relief from usefulness. It loves the mood of letting go. It loves the thought that we might stop striving, and often it turns this old, difficult suspicion into a soothing message with the hard parts removed. So now we have to face the modern trap. Why does Wu Wei so easily become self-help? The useless tree also asks us to reconsider survival. Sometimes survival depends on excellence. Sometimes it depends on not being selected by power. The straight tree becomes timber. The talented official becomes exhausted in service. The person who fits every demand is consumed by demands. The crooked thing lives because it cannot be easily used. This is not a doctrine of incompetence. It is a critique of systems that consume what they praise. Many societies celebrate usefulness while quietly destroying the useful. The most reliable worker receives more work. The most caring person receives more emotional burden. The most talented child receives more projection. Usefulness becomes extraction with compliments attached. Zhuangzi's tree gives us a way to name that without turning bitterness into philosophy. It does not say, never be useful. It says, do not let the world's current uses exhaust the meaning of your existence. Do not assume that being unfit for one purpose means being without value. Do not confuse the carpenter's disappointment with the truth of the tree. This has a direct bearing on non-forcing. To force life is often to demand that everything justify itself by our purposes. We ask what a thing is for before we ask what it is. We ask what a person produces before we ask how they live. We ask what rest accomplishes before allowing rest to be rest. The will to use is one of the most socially approved forms of domination. A serious treatment of Wu Wei must therefore protect uselessness from being immediately converted into usefulness. Even saying uselessness is useful can betray the story if we hear it too quickly. The point is not that uselessness secretly served productivity. The point is that value may exceed the whole regime of productivity. This is where the story becomes almost tender. The old tree shelters people precisely because it was not cut into something more respectable. Its gift appears because it escaped the obvious measure. Perhaps some forms of life need that escape. Perhaps action without domination includes the refusal to make every being answer the question, what can I do with you? Why does Wu Wei keep getting turned into self-help? The modern hunger for Wu Wei is real. We should not sneer at it. People are tired. Many live inside systems that reward constant striving and then call the exhaustion personal failure. The phrase "stop forcing life" lands because it names something they already feel. They know that more pressure is not healing the situation. They know that effort can become frantic. They know the hand is shaking, so the attraction is understandable. The problem is what often happens next. Wu Wei becomes a mood. Lao Tzu becomes a calm face on a quote card. The Daodejing becomes a source of soft permission to withdraw. The hard question of action becomes a promise that life will work out if we stop wanting too much. The tradition is translated into relief, and relief is treated as truth. This is not only inaccurate, it is less interesting. The shallow version says, let go. The serious question asks, What kind of grip is distorting action, and what kind of responsiveness might replace it? The shallow version says, stop trying. The serious question asks, which form of effort has become coercive and which form remains necessary? The shallow version says, trust the flow. The serious question asks, what does water actually show about non-contention, timing, lowliness, endurance, and power? We should be clear about what is lost when Wu Wei becomes self-help. The textual difficulty is lost. The opening warning about naming is lost. The political critique of over-governance is lost. The paradox of cultivated spontaneity is lost. The Zhuangzi's strange humor and cruelty and freedom are lost. The possibility that non-forcing may demand more honesty, not less, is lost. What remains is often a pleasant blur. A pleasant blur can comfort people. That is not nothing, but it cannot answer the deeper hunger beneath this question. We are not only seeking calm, we want to know whether non-forcing is real wisdom or passivity. We want the distinction. We want to understand why trying harder sometimes makes life worse without being told to abandon responsibility. The market has reasons to avoid that distinction. A clear distinction is harder to package. It does not fit neatly into a promise. It does not tell the viewer that everything will improve. It may even make life more demanding, because once we see coercion inside our own effort, we cannot unsee it easily. That is not the usual grammar of self-help. Modern content also tends to collapse traditions. Daoism becomes Buddhism, becomes Zen, becomes Alan Watts, becomes productivity, becomes sleep ambience. The words drift away from their sources. A soothing voice smooths the differences. The viewer is left with an atmosphere called Eastern wisdom. GNP cannot do that. The whole purpose here is to keep the calm while restoring the difficulty. That means we need boundaries. Wu Wei is not manifestation. It is not the universe rewarding surrender. It is not a hack for effortless success. It is not permission to avoid grief, conflict, work, or moral risk. It is not a sleep tool. It is not a productivity method disguised as spirituality. If the idea becomes any of these, it has been bent toward the very culture of control it was supposed to question. The productivity version is especially revealing. It says, do less so you can get more. At first this sounds close to Wu Wei, but often it keeps the same old master in place. The goal is still maximized output. The self still wants control. Non-forcing becomes a cleverer way of forcing. The clenched hand learns to look open because an open hand performs better. That is not release, it is strategy. A serious reading of Wu Wei may indeed make some actions more effective. Cook Ding's blade works better because it does not collide. Water persists because it does not compete. The ruler may govern better by reducing interference. But if we approach the doctrine only as a way to win more efficiently, we have missed its challenge to winning as the supreme measure. There is also a therapeutic temptation. Many of us come to these topics through stress, anxiety, burnout, and disappointment. Again, we should not mock that. Philosophy often begins where life hurts, but this question cannot become therapy. It cannot promise healing. It can offer clarity about a form of action. We may find that clarity personally meaningful, but the idea must not turn into a cure. This discipline matters for trust. When philosophy promises transformation too quickly, it starts lying. The Daodejing does not remove tragedy. Zhuangzi does not make loss easy, even when he plays strangely with grief. Early Daoist thought does not guarantee that the world will become gentle if we stop forcing it. It asks whether our forcing is adding suffering, confusion, and artificiality to an already difficult world. That is enough. The modern trap also shows why Lao Tzu's name is so powerful. The name is familiar, it carries longing, it signals an ancient source. But the very familiarity can become dangerous. A famous name attracts projections. People come looking for the Lao Tzu they already know, the peaceful sage, the gentle quote, the smiling permission to let go. We have to pass through that door without staying inside the cliché. So the path is narrow. We preserve the hunger for not forcing. We refuse the self-help promise. We keep the tone calm without making the question a sedative. We explain the sources without turning the inquiry into a lecture. We let the idea remain difficult enough to be real. That difficulty becomes most important when non-forcing meets resistance. It is easy to praise water beside a quiet stream. It is harder to ask what happens when someone is harmed, when conflict arrives, when action is morally urgent, when waiting may become complicity. If Wu Wei cannot face those cases, it becomes a luxury. So we have to ask the harder question now. The modern flattening of Wu Wei also thrives because ambiguity is uncomfortable. We want clean promises. We want results. We want a feeling that can be named quickly and kept without effort. Wu Wei, treated seriously, resists all of that. It is attractive because it sounds simple and valuable because it is not simple. This creates a deeper problem for any honest account of the idea. If we avoid the familiar phrase, "stop forcing life," we may miss the human need inside the question. If we use the phrase carelessly, we may invite the wrong promise. The solution is not to become obscure. It is to let the familiar phrase open the door, then immediately deepen what it means. Hunger has to be met with depth, not flattered into a slogan. That is why the first image matters so much. A soothing beginning would confirm the wrong instinct. A string of gentle quotations would confirm the cliché. A promise of peace would betray the source. The cracked bowl does something different. It lets us feel the problem of forced action before any doctrine arrives. It says, this is about the failure of control, not the comfort of escape. We also need to be fair to the viewer who came for relief. They are not foolish. The need is real. Many people have been told that every difficulty is solved by more effort, more discipline, more optimization. When that fails, they search for another language. Daoist thought can meet that search, but it should not flatter exhaustion by pretending that all demands are false or that all struggle is coercion. A serious inquiry can offer a better kind of relief, the relief of precision. It can say, you were right to suspect that forcing sometimes makes things worse. But the answer is not withdrawal. The answer is a more difficult responsiveness. That may not be as instantly soothing as a slogan. It is more respectful. So the modern trap teaches us something useful. It shows the hunger and the distortion together. We do not have to reject the hunger. We have to refuse the distortion. The viewer came asking whether not forcing is wisdom or passivity. Our task is to make that question harder, clearer, and more durable than the market usually allows. Does Wu Wei tell us what to do when action is morally urgent? Every philosophy of action has to face the moment when reality does not gently open. A child is in danger, a ruler is cruel, a friend is being humiliated, a community is threatened, a decision cannot be postponed. If non-forcing only works when nothing important is at stake, then it is not wisdom, it is atmosphere. So we need to be honest. Early Daoist texts do not give us a modern decision procedure for every moral crisis. They do not tell us exactly when to intervene, how much force is justified, what institutions owe to citizens, or how to balance competing harms. If we pretend they do, we are forcing the texts into our needs. But they do give us a suspicion that matters precisely in urgent situations. Urgency can become the alibi of domination. Because something matters, we assume our first impulse is authorized. Because harm is real, we assume any pressure applied against it is wise. Because delay is dangerous, we stop asking whether our action understands the situation. That is a perilous assumption. Non-forcing cannot mean refusal to act against harm. That would be morally empty. If a person uses Wu Wei to avoid protecting the vulnerable, they have not become subtle, they have become evasive. Responsiveness includes response. Sometimes the fitting response is interruption, refusal, boundary, protection, or command. A philosophy that could never say no would not be non-coercive. It would be useless in the worst sense. But coercion can enter even righteous action. We know this too. A movement begins with real grievance and slowly becomes addicted to purification. A parent begins by protecting a child and slowly becomes unable to let the child breathe. A reformer begins by opposing cruelty and slowly learns to enjoy the power of accusation. The cause may be serious, the will can still become distorted. Wu Wei asks us to preserve perception under pressure. This is extremely difficult. In calm conditions, responsiveness can sound elegant. Under threat, the body hardens, the mind narrows, the voice becomes certain. Sometimes narrowing is necessary. If a car is coming, we pull someone back. We do not hold a seminar about non-coercive contact. But many human conflicts unfold over longer durations, with partial knowledge, mixed motives, and complicated histories. In those cases, force that feels clean may be making the knot tighter. The Daodejing's counsel to handle difficulties while they are still easy belongs here. It suggests that wise action may prevent situations from becoming arenas where only crude force remains. The best intervention may be early and light. A small correction before resentment becomes hatred. A quiet conversation before public humiliation. A policy that removes pressure before desperation hardens. Non-forcing is not late passivity. It may be early responsiveness. Still, there are times when early lightness has failed. Then the question becomes, what kind of firmness can remain non-dominating? This sounds paradoxical, but we know the difference. A boundary can be set to protect a relation, or to punish someone for threatening our control. A law can restrain harm, or expand the vanity of the state. A hard word can clarify reality, or crush a person into submission. The outer shape may look similar, the relation differs. This is why Daoist thought cannot be reduced to visible behavior. The same act may be coercive in one context and responsive in another. Refraining may be wise today and cowardly tomorrow. Speaking may be domination in one room and responsibility in another. The absence of a formula is not a defect. It is the cost of taking situations seriously. We should not use this complexity to excuse ourselves from judgment. Some actions are wrong. Some harms must be stopped. Some power must be resisted. The point is not to dissolve moral life into mist. The point is to ask whether our methods are reproducing the domination we oppose. If they are, then even success may carry the seed of another failure. This is where the political and personal readings of Wu Wei meet. The ruler who overgoverns and the individual who overcontrols are not the same. But both reveal the danger of a will that mistakes reach for wisdom. When resistance appears, both are tempted to tighten. The more the world resists, the more they feel justified in force. Wu Wei asks whether resistance might instead be information. Not all resistance is wise. A rock in the road may need to be moved. A harmful institution may need to be dismantled. A bad habit may need to be interrupted. But even then, the manner of action matters. Are we studying the grain before cutting? Are we distinguishing root from symptom? Are we acting before the knot tightens, or waiting until violence feels inevitable? Are we protecting life or protecting our image of ourselves as decisive? These questions slow us down. Sometimes that slowing is dangerous. Sometimes it is the only thing that prevents damage. We cannot answer in advance for every case. That is uncomfortable, and it should be. A philosophy that made moral urgency easy would probably be lying. The early Daoist answer, if we can call it that, is not a rule but a suspicion. Beware of action that becomes intoxicated with its own necessity. Beware of force that calls itself care and refuses correction. Beware of control that uses danger as permission to stop listening. At the same time, beware of restraint that hides fear. Beware of softness that leaves others exposed. Beware of spiritual language that lets the comfortable remain untouched. The path between domination and abandonment is narrow. No slogan can walk it for us. So what remains? a form of action that tries to be firm without becoming possessive, responsive without becoming weak, restrained without becoming absent, decisive without becoming drunk on decision. This is not easy. It is much harder than the popular phrase "stop forcing life" suggests. And that is why Wu Wei remains philosophically interesting. It does not solve the moral life by telling us to relax. It deepens the moral life by making every action answer for its relation to the world. Even necessary action can force, even restraint can fail. We have to keep seeing. Now we are ready to gather the argument. The final answer cannot be a rule, because the doctrine has resisted rule-making from the beginning, but it can still tell us something about action without domination. Resistance also forces us to examine anger. Anger is not always wrong. Sometimes anger sees a violation clearly before polite reason is willing to name it. Sometimes anger supplies energy where passivity has become complicity. A doctrine of non-forcing that simply distrusts anger would be too clean and too safe. But anger can also become a form of intoxication. It can make the world seem simpler than it is. It can turn persons into targets and targets into objects. It can begin as perception and end as appetite. The question is not whether anger may appear. The question is whether anger remains answerable to reality after it appears. A non-coercive action in conflict may therefore include anger without being governed entirely by anger. It may use the heat to see what must be refused, while refusing to let heat decide every method. This is difficult because anger often wants to call its own intensity truth. Wu Wei asks intensity to submit to contact. There is a similar problem with fear. Fear may warn us. It may also make every ambiguity look like threat. A fearful ruler overgoverns. A fearful parent overcontrols. A fearful reformer purifies the movement until no one can breathe. In each case, force presents itself as protection. Sometimes protection is needed. Sometimes fear is expanding its kingdom. This is why non-forcing under resistance is not gentle in the sentimental sense. It can be severe toward our motives. It asks whether the force we are about to use is actually serving the vulnerable or serving our need to feel safe, righteous, decisive, or pure. That question may slow the hand. It may also make the hand more exact when it must move. The result is not moral certainty. It is moral sobriety. We act, but we know action can corrupt itself. We restrain, but we know restraint can become abandonment. We speak, but we know speech can dominate. We wait, but we know waiting can betray. No formula removes this burden. Wu Wei keeps us inside it with our eyes open. What can we honestly say Wu Wei offers? After all these turns, the answer has become both clearer and less simple. Wu Wei is not inactivity. It is not passivity. It is not a mystical guarantee. It is not a productivity method. It is not a refusal of responsibility. It is not merely a feeling of calm. It is a changed relation between intention, circumstance, and action. The will still exists. The hand still moves. The ruler still governs. The craftsperson still works. The friend still speaks. The question is whether action begins from domination or contact. Does the will arrive as master, or does it allow the situation to teach it how to move? This is the deepest thread running through the images. The hand that presses too hard loses the object. The text that resists naming warns us against possessing the path through words. Wu Wei refuses to mean doing nothing. Water acts by yielding to shape. The ruler who does less questions the vanity of power. Cook Ding shows skill after the self stops shouting. Trying not to try exposes the paradox of manufacturing spontaneity. The useless tree resists a world that values only capture. The modern let-go trap shows how easily the doctrine can be softened into a commodity. Moral resistance keeps the whole idea honest. The thread is not laziness. It is non-domination. That word can sound political, and it is, but it is also bodily, linguistic, ethical, and practical. To dominate is to impose a form without adequate relation. It is to make the other thing bear the shape of our intention. Non-domination does not mean we never shape the world. Every action shapes. It means the shaping remains answerable to what is being shaped. This answer is modest. It will disappoint anyone who wanted Lao Tzu to hand us a formula, but the modesty is part of the seriousness. A formula would let us escape the burden of attention. Wu Wei keeps returning us to attention. This situation, this timing, this material, this person, this institution, this grief, this danger, this opening. There is an ethics in that kind of attention. It does not look like moral grandstanding. It may not announce itself at all. It asks us to notice when our help has become takeover, when our discipline has become rigidity, when our speech has become possession, when our restraint has become fear. It also asks us to notice when the world is offering a way through that force would have missed. We should preserve the textual boundaries. The Daodejing is not a single modern argument with premises and conclusion. The Laozi figure is not historically transparent. The Zhuangzi is not simply a commentary by the same author. Early Daoist materials contain tensions, ambiguities, and contexts we cannot erase, but the philosophical pressure is strong enough to survive those cautions. Across these materials, we find a recurring distrust of coercive artifice and a fascination with action that works by not forcing. What happens then when action stops trying to force life? First, perception returns. The world is no longer only the object of our plan. We begin to see grain, timing, resistance, opening, limit. This does not mean the world becomes kind. It means we stop adding blindness to difficulty. Second, effort changes quality. We may still work hard. Cook Ding did not become skilled by avoiding practice. The ruler who restrains himself may require more discipline than the ruler who interferes. The friend who listens may be doing something harder than the friend who rushes to advise. Non-forcing does not abolish effort, it removes some of the violence from effort. Third, power becomes less theatrical. The strongest action may not be the loudest. It may be the smallest adjustment made at the right time. It may be the refusal to compete on terms that would corrupt the action. It may be the capacity to go low without humiliation, to bend without surrender, to wait without disappearing. Fourth, responsibility becomes more difficult. This is important. Wu Wei is not an escape from responsibility. It may increase responsibility because it removes our favorite excuses. We can no longer say, "I meant well," as though intention were enough. We can no longer say, "I acted strongly," as though force were wisdom. We have to ask what our action did to the situation it entered. This is a demanding question. It has no clean endpoint. We will fail it often. We will force when we meant to respond. We will withdraw when we should have moved. We will confuse anxiety with care and caution with wisdom. The tradition does not make us pure. It gives us a way to notice the failure. Perhaps that is already valuable. A philosophy does not have to solve life to illuminate it. Sometimes it gives us a distinction sharp enough that ordinary experience changes. After Wu Wei, the clenched hand is no longer just a hand trying hard, it is a question. The overmanaged room is no longer just orderly, it is a question. The beautiful useless tree is no longer merely wasted timber, it is a question. The question keeps returning. Is this action, or is it domination wearing the face of action? We should also notice the tenderness of the idea. To stop forcing is to admit that the world is not simply ours. Other people are not simply ours. Even our own lives are not simply ours in the way a tool is ours. We participate in conditions we did not create. We respond to bodies, histories, seasons, losses, and limits. The will is real, but it is not sovereign over everything it touches. That admission can feel like weakness if we worship control, but it can also be the beginning of sanity. The hand that stops forcing has not vanished, it is still there, It is more present, not less. It can feel the bowl. It can sense the crack. It can wait for the glue to settle. It can accept that repair is not the same as conquest. This is why the closing answer has to remain bounded. Wu Wei does not tell us that life rewards surrender. It does not tell us never to strive. It does not tell us that all conflict can be dissolved by softness. It does not give a modern decision procedure for every crisis. It does something quieter. It places a permanent question inside action itself. Before we act, are we in contact? If the answer is no, then more force may only deepen the error. If the answer is yes, action may become possible in a different form. It may be restrained, it may be decisive, it may be patient, it may be swift. Its outer shape cannot be known in advance. Its inner discipline is non-coercive responsiveness. That is the serious promise hidden behind the familiar phrase. Stopping force does not make life easy. It makes action more honest. It asks the will to become less like a conqueror and more like a listener. It asks power to doubt its own reach. It asks skill to follow the openings. It asks language to remember what it cannot hold. And perhaps, when it works, something simple happens. The action stops standing between us and the world. It becomes one way the world answers itself through us. That is not doing nothing. It is action without domination. There is one last synthesis we should make before closing. Wu Wei keeps moving between three scales: the body, the word, and power. In the body, it asks what the hand can feel when it stops clutching. In language, it asks what a name can reveal when it stops pretending to possess. In power, it asks what authority can protect when it stops needing to display itself. These are not separate lessons. They are the same pattern seen from different distances. At the smallest scale, forcing is a loss of touch. At the middle scale, forcing is a loss of humility before meaning. At the largest scale, forcing is a loss of trust in living order. Each loss produces a compensating hardness. The hand presses, the concept freezes, the ruler interferes. Each believes it is becoming stronger. Each may actually be becoming less intelligent. That is why the old images are so stubborn. They do not let us escape into abstraction. Water does not compete. The blade follows spaces. The tree survives outside usefulness. The bowl cracks under pressure. These images return because the concept alone is too easy to domesticate. We can agree with non-forcing as an idea while continuing to force every actual situation we meet. An image can catch us earlier, before the defense is ready. We should also acknowledge what remains unresolved. If someone asks for a complete theory of action, Wu Wei will frustrate them. If someone asks for a rule that distinguishes restraint from cowardice every time, the early texts will not provide it. If someone asks how exactly to govern a modern state, protect rights, respond to structural injustice, or design institutions, the Daodejing cannot simply be lifted out of its world and made to answer. Serious interpretation has to respect that distance. But distance does not mean silence. A text can fail to be a manual and still be a mirror. It can refuse to solve our institutions and still show us something about the coercive fantasy inside institutions. It can leave moral theory unfinished and still make moral attention sharper. It can be historically strange and still philosophically alive. This is the kind of payoff GNP should preserve. We are not extracting a life lesson. We are staying with a pressure in the history of thought. The pressure says, perhaps action is not most itself when it dominates. Perhaps wisdom is not the maximum extension of will. Perhaps some things become possible only when the self stops treating every limit as an enemy. If that sounds calming, it is only partly calming. It may also be unsettling, because a great deal of modern life is built on the opposite assumption. We are asked to optimize ourselves, manage others, brand our attention, convert rest into recovery for production, convert difficulty into technique, and convert even letting go into a strategy for getting more. Wu Wei does not merely soothe that world. it judges it, and its judgment is quiet enough that we may miss it. It does not shout against force with greater force. It places water beside stone. It places a useless tree beside the carpenter's measuring eye. It places a skilled cook beside the ruler's command. It lets the image work on us until our admiration begins to shift. That shift may be the honest answer, not a new certainty, but a changed admiration. We begin to admire contact more than domination, timing more than pressure, fit more than display, responsiveness more than control. Once admiration changes, action may eventually change too. One more consequence follows from this, and it matters for the whole question. Wu Wei is not a doctrine that can be verified only by inner feeling. A person may feel unforced and still be careless. They may feel calm while others carry the cost of their calm. They may feel natural because they have never had to question the conditions that support them. So the test cannot be a private mood. It has to include the world the action touches. Does the action leave more contact or less? Does it clarify the relation or conceal it? Does it reduce unnecessary domination, or does it simply move domination out of sight? These questions keep the idea from becoming self-protective. They turn Wu Wei outward again, toward the bowl, the listener, the governed, the harmed, the tree, the blade, the current. This outwardness is what saves the doctrine from becoming a sleep state. The tone can be calm, but the attention is awake. We are not drifting away from responsibility. We are looking more closely at the forms responsibility takes. Sometimes responsibility will speak, sometimes it will wait, sometimes it will intervene early and lightly, sometimes it will refuse firmly, because refusal is the only response that still honors the situation. The point is not to predetermine the outer shape. The point is to prevent the inner relation from becoming conquest. That is also why Wu Wei cannot be owned by temperament. A quiet person is not automatically closer to it. A decisive person is not automatically farther away. Quiet can be avoidance. Decisiveness can be responsive. The old mistake is to identify non-forcing with a personality style. The deeper question cuts through style. It asks whether this action, here, now, is fitted to reality or imposed upon it. If we keep that question alive, the doctrine remains serious. It can speak to exhausted modern viewers without flattering exhaustion. It can correct self-help without becoming dry scholarship. It can stay close to Laozi and the Daodejing while admitting textual uncertainty. It can use Zhuangzi's stories without pretending they are the same voice. Most importantly, it can preserve the promise. Stopping force does not mean quitting life. It means discovering whether action can become less coercive and more awake. So the answer has to stay double. On one side, it is simple enough to remember. Action can stop forcing without disappearing. On the other side, it is difficult enough to resist possession. No one can know in advance, by slogan alone, what non-forcing requires. The simplicity keeps the question clear. The difficulty keeps it honest. This double character is why the phrase "stop forcing life" works only if we refuse the easy version of it. What happens when you stop forcing life? Not necessarily peace, not guaranteed success, not the sudden cooperation of the world. What happens first is that the old measure of action starts to fail. We can no longer trust effort merely because it is intense. We can no longer distrust restraint merely because it is quiet. We have to learn a more delicate grammar of agency. That grammar is ancient but not antique. It appears whenever a person discovers that a situation cannot be bullied into truth. It appears whenever a leader realizes that constant intervention is deforming the people it claims to guide. It appears whenever a skilled hand follows a path that a command could not have found. It appears whenever a useless thing survives the measuring eye long enough to reveal another kind of value. None of these appearances gives us mastery. They give us practice. We return to the world with a slightly different ear. We listen for force inside care. We listen for cowardice inside restraint. We listen for the point where effort loses contact and starts protecting its own image. That listening may be the beginning of Wu Wei in ordinary life, and because it is practice, it will include failure. We will notice too late. We will press the bowl and hear the crack widen. We will name someone too quickly. We will call an intervention necessary because we wanted the relief of acting. We will call withdrawal wise because we feared the cost of response. The point is not to imagine a sage who never makes these mistakes. The point is to make the mistakes more visible. Visibility matters. Once a form of force becomes visible, it is no longer simply identical with seriousness. We can pause before repeating it. We can repair after it. We can ask someone else what our action felt like from where they stood. This humility is not outside Wu Wei. It may be one of its ordinary forms, letting reality answer back, even when that answer corrects us. Before closing, hold that modest practice in view. We have not found a mood, a method, or a promise that softness will always win. We have followed a pressure inside action. The possibility that care becomes wiser when it stops needing to conquer what it loves, even when outcomes remain uncertain. That is enough to bring us back to the first image. Return to the bowl on the table. The woman has not disappeared. Her care has not disappeared. The crack is still there. The repair still has to be made. Nothing about Wu Wei removes the need for a hand, but the hand changes. It no longer treats the bowl as an enemy. It no longer mistakes urgency for steadiness. It no longer imagines that pressure proves devotion. It waits long enough to feel the edge. It moves where the material allows movement. It withdraws where pressure would widen the damage. The action is smaller than before. It is also more faithful. This is the difference the Daoist idea has been circling. Not action versus inaction. Not effort versus ease. Not control versus collapse. The deeper contrast is between coercive action and responsive action. One forces the world to carry the will's shape. The other lets the world help determine the shape of the act. Lao Tzu gives us the familiar name. The Daodejing gives us water, softness, suspicion of naming, and the ruler who does less. The Zhuangzi gives us the cook, the wheelwright, the useless tree, and the strange humor of skill and freedom. Together, without becoming one doctrine, these materials keep asking us to doubt the clenched hand. They do not ask us to become passive. They do not ask us to abandon responsibility. They do not ask us to believe that the universe will reward surrender. They ask whether the will, in trying to dominate everything it touches, has become less intelligent than it thinks. That question matters because it reaches ordinary life. We can force a conversation, a repair, a child, a community, a body, a grief, a plan, a future. Sometimes we call this care. Sometimes it is fear trying to look responsible. Action can be strong without being rigid. It can be restrained without being absent. It can be cultivated without being artificial. It can be effective without needing to conquer. It can listen before it moves. What kind of action becomes possible when the will stops trying to dominate everything it touches? A later Western tradition will ask a neighboring question: what, if anything, is truly ours to command? Marcus Aurelius will answer from discipline, duty, and the inner citadel. Laozi and the Daoist texts answer from water, softness, timing, and the suspicion of force. The questions are not the same, but they look at one another across the centuries. For now, the bowl is still on the table, the crack is still visible, the hand is still needed. If we leave with anything, let it be this distinction. The opposite of forcing is not vacancy. It is presence without domination. A vacant person is gone from the scene. A responsive person is more deeply there. They are not less responsible because they have stopped forcing. They may be responsible for the first time in a way that can actually hear. That presence can be prepared for and remembered after failure. We can notice when the hand has closed and open it again. We can notice when a name has become a cage and loosen it. We can notice when power has begun to love its own reach and ask what life underneath that reach is losing. These notices are small. Philosophy often works by changing what we notice. Pressure may look like care after the question. Pressure has to answer for itself. Doing less may look like absence. After the question, restraint can become one form of action. None of this saves us from difficulty. The world will still resist. Some cracks will not repair. Some conflicts will require speech, law, refusal, or force in the ordinary sense. Wu Wei does not make us innocent. It asks us to act while remembering how easily action becomes domination. That memory may be its quiet gift. Only the grip has changed.